Anyway, we pick back up on the bottom of 262, Love in the Time of Cholera, Chapter 5, bottom of 262. "Hairless wonder," he shouted. That night, at the age of 48, he had the few downy strands left at his temples and the nape of his neck cut off, and he embraced with all his heart the destiny of total baldness. Every morning before his bath he lathered not only on his chin, but the areas on his scalp where stubble was beginning to appear, and with a barber's razor he left everything as smooth as a baby's bottom. Until then he would not remove his hat even in the office, for his baldness produced a sensation of nakedness that seemed indecent to him. But when he accepted his baldness with all his heart, he attributed it to the masculine virtues that he had heard about and scorned as nothing but the fantasies of bald men. Later, he took refuge in the new custom of combing long hairs from his part on the right all the way across his head, and this he never abandoned. Ugh, the comb-over. But even so, he continued to wear his hat, always the same funereal style, even after the tartarita, the local name for the straw skimmer, came into fashion. The loss of his teeth, on the other hand, did not result from a natural calamity, but from the shoddy work of an itinerant, I think. But from the shoddy work of an itinerant dentist who decided to eradicate a simple infection by drastic means. His terror of the drill had prevented Florentino Ariza from visiting a dentist despite his constant toothaches until the pain became unbearable. His mother was alarmed by a night of inconsolable moaning from the room next to hers, because these moans seemed to be the same ones as from another time, which had almost disappeared into the mists of her memory. But when she made him open his mouth to see where love was hurting him, she discovered that he had fallen victim to abscesses. Uncle Leo XII sent him to Dr. Francis Adonai, a black giant in gaiters and jodhpurs, who traveled the river boats with complete dental equipment that he carried in a steward's saddlebag, and who seemed to be more like a traveling salesman of terror in the villages along the river. With just one glance in his mouth, he decided that Florentino Ariza had to have even his healthy teeth and molars extracted in order to protect him once and for all from further misfortunes. In contrast to baldness, this radical treatment caused him no alarm at all, except for his natural fear of a bloodbath without anesthesia. The idea of false teeth did not disturb him either, first because one of his fondest childhood memories was a carnival magician who removed his upper and lower teeth and left them chattering by themselves on a table, and second because it would end the toothaches that tormented him ever since he was a boy, with almost as much cruelty as the pains of love. Unlike baldness, it did not seem to him an underhanded attack by old age, because he was convinced that despite the bitter breath of vulcanized rubber, his appearance would be cleaner with an orthopedic smile. So he submitted without resistance to the red-hot forceps of Dr. Adonai, and he endured his convalescence with the stoicism of a pack mule. Uncle Leo XII attended to the details of the operation as if it were being performed on his own flesh. His singular interest in false teeth had developed on one of his first trips along the Magdalena River, and was the result of his maniacal love for bel canto. One night, when the moon was full, at the entrance to the port of Gamara, he made a wager with a German surveyor that he could awaken the creatures of the jungle by singing a Napoleon romanza from the captain's balustrade. He almost lost the bet. In the river darkness, one could hear the flapping wings of the cranes in the marshes, the thudding tails of the alligators, the terror of the shad as they tried to leap onto dry land, and on the final note, when it was feared that the singer would burst his arteries with the power of his song, his false teeth dropped out of his mouth with his last breath and fell into the water. Embarrassing. The boat had to wait 3 days at the port of Tenerife while an emergency set was made for him. It was a perfect fit, but on the voyage home, trying to explain to the captain how he had lost the first pair, Uncle Leo XII filled his lungs with the burning air of the jungle, sang the highest note he could, held it to his last breath as he tried to frighten the alligators that were sunning themselves and watching the passage of the boat with unblinking eyes, and the new set of false teeth sank into the current as well. From then on, he kept spare sets of teeth everywhere, in various places throughout his house, in his desk drawer, and on each of the 3 company boats. Moreover, when he ate out, he would carry an extra pair in a cough drop box that he kept in his pocket, because he had once broken a pair trying to eat pork cracklings at a picnic. Fearing that his nephew might be the victim of similar unpleasant surprises, Uncle Leo the XII told Dr. Adney to make him 2 sets right from the start. One of cheap materials for daily use at the office, and the other for Sundays and holidays, with a gold chip in the first molar that would impart a touch of realism. At last, on a Palm Sunday ringing with the sound of holiday bells, Florentino Ariza returned to the street with a new identity, his perfect smile giving him the impression that someone else had taken his place in the world. This was at the time that his mother died, and Florentino Ariza was left alone in his house. It was a haven that suited his way of loving, because the location was discreet despite the fact that the numerous windows that gave the street its name made one think of too many eyes behind the curtains. But the house had been built to make Ferminadaza house had been built to make Ferminadaza and no one but Ferminadaza happy, so that Florentino Ariza preferred to lose a good many opportunities during his most fruitful years rather than soil his house with other loves. To his good fortune, every step he climbed in the RCC brought new privileges above all secret privileges, and one of the most practical was the possibility of using the offices at night or on Sundays or holidays with the complicity of the watchmen. Once, when he was first vice president, he was making emergency love to one of the Sunday girls sitting on a desk chair with her astride him. When the door opened without warning, Uncle Leo the XII peered in as if he had walked into the wrong office and stared at his terrified nephew over his eyeglasses. "I'll be damned," said his uncle, without the least sign of shock. "You screw just like your dad." And before he closed the door, he said, with his eyes looking off into the distance, "And you, senorita, feel free to carry on. I swear by my honor that I have not seen your face." The matter was not mentioned again, but the following week it was impossible to work in Florentino Ariza's office. On Monday, the electricians burst in to install a rotating fan on the ceiling. The locksmiths arrived unannounced and with as much noise as if they were going to war, installed a lock on the door so that it could be bolted from the inside. The carpenters took measurements without saying why. The upholsterers brought swatches of cretonne to see if they matched the colors of the wall. And the next week, an enormous double couch covered in a Dionysian flowered print was delivered through the window because it was too big for the doors. They worked at the oddest hours with an impertinence that did not seem unintentional, and they offered the same responses to all his protests: orders from the head office. Florentino Ariza never knew if this sort of interference was a kindness of his uncle's part or a very personal way of forcing him to face up to his abusive behavior. The truth never occurred to him, which was that Uncle Leo the XII was encouraging his nephew, because he, too, had heard the rumors that his habits were different from those of most men, and this obstacle to naming him as his successor had caused him great distress. Bottom of 265. Unlike his brother, Leo the XII Loaysa had enjoyed a stable marriage of 60 years' duration, and he was always proud of not working on Sundays. He had 4 sons and a daughter, and he wanted to prepare all of them as heirs to his empire, but by a series of coincidences that were common in the novels of the day, but that no one believed in real life, his 4 sons died, one after the other as they rose to positions of authority, and his daughter had no river vocation whatsoever and preferred to die watching the boats on the Hudson from a window 50 meters high. There were even those who accepted as true the tale that Florentino Ariza, with his sinister appearance and his vampire's umbrella, had somehow been the cause of all those coincidences. When the doctor's orders forced his uncle into retirement, Florentino Ariza began with good grace to sacrifice some of his Sunday loves. He accompanied his uncle to his country retreat in one of the city's first automobiles, whose crank candle had such a powerful recoil that it had dislocated the shoulder of the first driver. They talked for many hours, the old man in the hammock with his name embroidered in silk thread removed from everything and with his back to the sea, in the old slave plantation from whose terraces, filled with crepe myrtle, One could see the snow-covered peaks in of the Sierra in the afternoon. It had always been difficult for Florentino Ariza and his uncle to talk about anything other than river navigation, and it was still one of those slow afternoons when death was always an unseen guest. One of Uncle Leo XII's constant preoccupations was that river navigation not pass into the hands of entrepreneurs from the interior with connections to European corporations. This has always been a business run by people from the coast, he would say. If the inlanders get a hold of it, they will give it back to the Germans. His preoccupation was consistent with a political conviction that he liked to repeat even when it was not to the point. I am almost 100 years old, and I have seen everything change, even the position of the stars in the universe. But I have not seen anything change yet in this country, he would say. Here they make new constitutions, new laws, new wars every 3 months, but we are still in colonial times. To his brother Masons, who attributed all evil to the failure of federalism, he would always reply, "The War of 1,000 Days was lost 23 years ago in the War of 76. Florentino Ariza, whose indifference to politics hovered in the limits of the absolute, listened to these increasingly frequent and tiresome speeches as one listens to the sound of the sea, but he was a rigorous debater when it came to company policy. In opposition to his uncle's opinion, he thought that the setbacks in the river navigation, always on the edge of disaster, could be remedied only by a voluntary renunciation of the riverboat monopoly that the National Congress had granted to the River Company of the Caribbean for 9 years and a day. His uncle protested, "My namesake Leona, with her worthless anarchist theories, has put those ideas in your head." But that was only half true. Florentino Ariza based his thinking on the experience of the German Commodore Johann B. Albers, whose noble intelligence had been destroyed by excessive personal ambition. His uncle, however, believed that the failure of Albers was due not to privileges, but to the unrealistic commitments he had contracted for, which had almost been tantamount to his assuming responsibility for the geography of the nation. He had taken charge of maintaining the navigability of the river, the port installations, the access routes on land, the means of transportation. Besides, he would say, the virulent opposition of President Simón Bolívar was no laughing matter. Most of his business associates viewed those disputes as if they were matrimonial arguments in which both parties are right. The old man's obstinacy seemed natural to them, not because it was too easy to say, old age had made him less visionary than he had always been, but because renouncing the monopoly must have seemed to him like throwing away the victories of a historic battle that he and his brothers had waged unaided back in heroic times against powerful adversaries from all over the world. Which is why no one opposed him when he kept so tight a hold on his rights that no one could touch them before their legal expiration. But suddenly, when Florentino Ariza had already surrendered his weapons during those meditative afternoons on the plantation, Uncle Leo XII agreed to renounce the centenarian privilege on the one honorable condition that it not take place before his death. It was his final act. He did not speak of business again. He did not even allow anyone to consult with him. He did not lose a single ringlet from his splendid imperial head or an iota of his lucidity, but he did everything possible to keep anyone from seeing him who might pity him. He passed the days in contemplation of the perpetual snows from his terrace, rocking slowly in a Viennese rocker next to a table where the servants always kept a pot of black coffee hot for him, along with a glass of water with boric acid that contained 2 plates of false teeth, which he no longer used except to receive visitors. He saw very few friends, and he would speak only of a past so remote that it antedated river navigation. But he still had one new topic of conversation left, his desire that Florentino Ariza marry. He expressed his wish to him several times, and always in the same way. "If I were 50 years younger," he would say, "I would marry my namesake Leona. I cannot imagine a better wife." Florentino Ariza trembled at the idea of his labor of so many years being frustrated at the last moment by this unforeseen circumstance. He would have preferred to renounce everything, throw it all away, die, rather than fail for Mendoza. Fortunately, Uncle Leo XII did not insist. When he turned 92, he recognized his nephew as sole heir and retired from the company. 6 months later, by unanimous agreement, Florentino Arizo was named president of the board of directors and general manager of the company. After the champagne toast on the day he took over the post, the old lion in retirement excused himself for speaking without getting up from the rocker, and he improvised a brief speech that seemed more like an elegy. He said that his life had begun and ended with 2 providential events. The first was that the Liberator had carried him in his arms in the village of Turbaco when he was making his ill-fated journey toward death. The other had been finding, despite all the obstacles that destiny had interposed, a successor worthy of the company. At last, trying to undramatize the drama, he concluded, "The only frustration I carry away from this life is that of singing at so many funerals except my own." Oh. It goes without saying that, to close the ceremony, he sang the Addio alla vita from Tosca. He sang it a cappella, which was the style he preferred, in a voice that was still steady. Florentino Arizo was moved, and he showed it only in the slight tremor in his voice as he expressed his thanks. In just the same way that he had done and thought everything he had done in his life, he had scaled the heights only because of his fierce determination to be alive and in good health at the moment he would fulfill his destiny in the shadow of Fermina Daza. However, it was not her memory alone that accompanied him to the party Leona Cassiani gave him for that night. The memory of them all was with him, those who slept in the cemeteries thinking of him through the roses he planted over them, as well as those who still laid their heads on the pillow where their husbands slept, their horns golden in the moonlight, depraved of one, he wanted to be with them all at the same time, which is what he always wanted whenever he was fearful. For even during his most difficult times and at his worst moments, he had maintained some link, no matter how weak, with his countless lovers of so many years. He always kept track of their lives. And so that night he remembered Rosalba, the first one who had carried off the prize of his virginity, and whose memory was still as painful as it had been the first day. He had only to close his eyes to see her in her muslin dress and her hat with the long silk ribbons, rocking her child's cage on the deck of the boat. Several times in the course of the numerous years of his life he had been ready to set out in search of her, without knowing where or her last name, or if she was the one he was looking for, but certain of finding her somewhere among the groves of orchids. Each time, because of a real difficulty at the last minute or because of an ill-timed failure of his own will, his trip was postponed just as they were about to raise the gangplank, always for a reason that had something to do with Fermina Daza. Near the bottom of 269. He remembered the widow Nazareth, the only one with whom he had profaned his mother's house on the street of windows, although it had been Transito Ariza and not he who had asked her in. He was more understanding of her than any of the others, because she was the only one who radiated enough tenderness to compensate for Fermina Daza, despite her sluggishness in bed. But she had the inclinations of an alley cat, which were more indomitable than the strength of her tenderness, and this meant that both of them were condemned to infidelity. Still, they continued to be intermittent lovers for almost 30 years, thanks to their musketeer's motto, unfaithful but not disloyal. She was also the only one for whom Florentino Ariza assumed any responsibility. When he heard that she had died and was going to a pauper's grave, he buried her at his own expense, and was the only mourner at the funeral. Oh, some of this stuff is really sad. He remembered the other widows he had loved. He remembered Prudencia Pitre, the oldest of those still alive, who was known to everyone as the widow of 2, because she had outlived both of her husbands, and the other Prudencia, man, there's 2 of them, the widow Ariano, the amorous one who would rip the buttons from his clothes so that he would have to stay in her house while she sewed them back on, and Josefa, the widow Zuninga, mad with love for him, who was ready to cut off his penis with gardening shears while he slept, so that he would belong to no one else, even if he could not belong to her. He remembered Angeles Alfaro, the most ephemeral and best loved of them all, who came for 6 months to teach string instruments at the music school, and who spent moonlit nights with him on the flat roof of her house, and as naked as the day she was born, playing the most beautiful suites in all music, on a cello whose voice became human between her golden thighs. From the first moonlit night, both of them broke their hearts in the fierce love of inexperience. But Angeles Alfaro left as she had come, with her tender sex and her sinner's cello, on an ocean liner that flew the flag of oblivion, and all that remained of her on the moonlit roofs was a fluttered farewell with a white handkerchief like a solitary sad dove on the horizon, as if she were a verse from the poetic festival. With her, Florentino Ariza learned what he had already experienced many times without realizing it, that one can be in love with several people at the same time, feel the same sorrow with each, and not betray any of them. Alone in the midst of the crowd on the pier, he said to himself in a flash of anger, "My heart has more rooms than a whorehouse." He wept copious tears at the grief of parting, but as soon as the ship had disappeared over the horizon, the memory from Daza once again occupied all his space. He remembered Andrea Baron, outside whose house he had spent the previous week, but the orange light in the bathroom had been a warning that he could not go in. Someone had arrived before him. Someone, man or woman, because Andrea Baron did not hesitate over such details when it came to the follies of love. Of all those on the list, she was the only one who earned a living with her body, but she did so at her pleasure and without a business manager. In her day, she had enjoyed a legendary career as a clandestine courtesan who deserved her nom de guerre, Our Lady of Everybody. She drove governors and admirals mad. She watched eminent heroes of arms and letters who were not as illustrious as they believed, and even some who were, as they wept on her shoulder. It was true, however, that President Rafael Reyes was, after only a hurried half-hour between appointments in the city, granted her a lifetime pension for distinguished service to the Ministry of Finance, where she had never worked a day of her life. She distributed her gifts of pleasure as far as her body could reach, and although her indecent conduct was public knowledge, no one could have made a definitive case against her, because her eminent accomplices gave her the same protection they gave themselves, knowing that they had more to lose in a scandal than she did. For her sake, Florentino Ariza had violated his sacred principle of never paying, and she had violated hers of never doing it free of charge, even with her husband. They had agreed upon a symbolic fee of 1 peso, which she did not take and he did not hand to her, but which they put in the piggy bank until enough of them had accumulated to buy something charming from overseas in the Arcade of the Scribes. It was she who attributed a distinctive sensuality to the enemas he used for his crisis of constipation, who convinced him to share them with her, and they took them together in the course of their mad afternoons as they tried to create even more love within their love. He considered it a stroke of good fortune that among so many hazardous encounters, the only woman who had made him taste a drop of bitterness was the Señora Sara Noriega, who ended her days in the Divine Shepherdess Asylum, reciting Signal verses in such outrageous obscenity that they were forced to isolate her so that she would not drive the rest of the mad women crazy. However, when he took over complete responsibility for the RCC, he no longer had much time or desire to attempt to replace Fermina Daza with anyone else. He knew that she was irreplaceable. Little by little, he had fallen into the routine of visiting the ones who were already established, sleeping with them for as long as they pleased him, for as long as he could, for as long as they lived. On the Pentecost Sunday, when Dr. Juvenal Urbino died, he had only one left, only one who had just turned 14, and had everything that no one else until then had had to make him mad with love. Ugh, that is rape. Anyway, her name was America Vicuña. She had arrived 2 years before from the fishing village of Puerto Padre, entrusted by her family to Florentino Ariza as her guardian and recognized blood relative. They sent her with a government scholarship to study secondary education with her petate in her little tin trunk as small as a doll's, and from the moment she walked off the boat with her high white shoes and her golden braid, he had the awful presentiment that they were going to take many Sunday siestas together. She was still a child in every sense of the word, with braces on her teeth and the scrapes of elementary school on her knees, but he saw right away the kind of woman she was going to be, and he cultivated her during a slow year of Saturdays at the circus, Sundays in the park with ice cream, childish late afternoons, and he won her confidence, he won her affection. He led her by the hand with the gentle astuteness of a kind grandfather toward his secret slaughterhouse. For her it was immediate. The doors of heaven opened to her. All at once she burst into flower, which left her floating in a limbo of happiness and which motivated her studies, for she was always at the head of her class, so that she would not lose the privilege of going out on weekends. For him it was the most sheltered inlet in the cove of his old age. After so many years of calculated loves, the mild pleasure of innocence had the charm of a restorative perversion. Ugh. I can't read this without disgust. They were in full agreement. She behaved like what she was, a girl ready to learn about life under the guidance of a venerable old man who was not shocked by anything, and he chose to behave like what he had feared most being in his life, a senile lover. He never identified her with the young Fermina Daza, despite a resemblance that was more than casual, and was not based only on their age, their school uniform, their braid, their untamed walk, and even their haughty and unpredictable character. Moreover, the idea of replacement, which had been so effectively an inducement for his mendicancy of love, had been completely erased from his mind. He liked her for what she was, and he came to love her for what she was, in a fever of crepuscular delights. She was the only one with whom he took drastic precautions against accidental pregnancy. After half a dozen encounters, there was no dream for either of them except their Sunday afternoons. Since he was the only person authorized to take her out of the boarding school, he would call for her in the 6-cylinder Hudson that belonged to the RCC, and sometimes they would lower the top if the afternoon was not sunny and drive along the beach, he with his somber hat, and she, weak with laughter, holding the sailor hat of her school uniform with both hands so that the wind would not blow it off. Someone had told her not to spend more time with her guardian than necessary, not to eat anything he had tasted, and not to put her face too close to his, for old age was contagious. But she did not care. They were both indifferent to what people might think of them because their family kinship was well known, and what is more, the extreme difference in their ages placed them beyond all suspicion. This is just kind of gross. Middle of 273. Ugh, I don't want to read this. They had just made love on Pentecost Sunday. Ugh. Rape. She's a child. Anyway. They had just made love on Pentecost Sunday when the bells began to toll at 4 o'clock. Florentino Ariza had to overcome the wild beating of his heart. In his youth, the ritual of the tolling bells had been included in the price of the funeral and was denied only to the indignant. But after our last war, just at the turn of the century, the conservative regime consolidated its colonial customs, and funeral rites became so expensive that only the wealthiest could pay for them. When Archbishop Dante da Luna died, bells over the province tolled unceasingly for 9 days and 9 nights, and the public suffering was so great that his successor reserved the tolling of bells for the funeral services of the most illustrious of the dead. Therefore, when Florentino Ariza heard the cathedral bells at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on a Pentecost Sunday, he felt as if he had been visited by a ghost from his lost youth. He never imagined they were the bells he had so longed to hear for so many years, ever since the Sunday when Fermina Daza in her 6th month when he saw Fermina Daza in her 6th month of pregnancy as she was leaving High Mass. "Damn," he said in the darkness. "It must be a very big fish for them to ring the cathedral bells." America Vicuña, completely naked, had just awakened. "It must be for Pentecost," she said. Florentino Ariza was in no way expert in matters pertaining to the church, and he had not gone to Mass again since he had played the violin in the choir with a German who also taught him the science of the telegraph, and about whose fate he had never been able to obtain any definite news. But he knew beyond any doubt that the bells were not ringing for Pentecost. There was a public mourning in the city, that was certain, and that is what he knew. A delegation of Caribbean refugees had come to his house that morning to inform him that Jeremiah de Saint-Amour had been found dead in his photography studio. Although Florentino Ariza was not an intimate friend of his, he was close to many other refugees who always invited him to their public ceremonies, above all to their funerals. But he was sure that the bells were not tolling for Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, who was a militant unbeliever and a committed anarchist, and who had, moreover, died by his own hand. "No," he said, "tolling like that must be for a governor at least." America Vicuña, her pale body dappled by the light coming in through the carelessly drawn blinds, was not of an age to think about death. They had made love after lunch, and they were lying together at the end of their siesta, both of them naked under the ceiling fan, whose humming could not hide the sound like falling hail that the buzzards made as they walked across the hot tin roof. Florentino Ariza loved her as he had loved so many other casual women in his long life, but he loved her with more anguish than any other, because he was certain he would be dead by the time she finished secondary school. The room resembled a ship's cabin, its walls made of wooden laths covered by many coats of paint, as were the walls of boats. But at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, even with the electric fan hanging over the bed, the heat was more intense than in the riverboat cabins because it reflected off the metal roof. It was not so much a formal bedroom as a cabin on dry land, which Florentino Ariza had built behind his office in the RCC, with no other purpose or pretext than to have a nice little refuge for his old man's loves. On ordinary days, it was difficult to sleep there, with the shouts of the stevedores and the noise of the cranes from the river harbor, and the enormous bellowing of the ships moored at the dock. For the girl, however, it was a Sunday paradise. They had planned to be together on Pentecost until she had to return to school 5 minutes before the Angelus, but the tolling of the bells reminded Florentino Ariza of his promise to attend the funeral of Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, and he dressed with more haste than usual. First, as always, he plaited her single braid that he himself had loosened before they made love, and he sat her on the table to tie the bow on her school shoes, which was something she never did well. He helped her without malice, and she helped him to help her, as if it were an obligation. After their first encounters, they had both lost awareness of their ages, and they treated each other with the familiarity of a husband and wife who had hidden so many things in this life that there was almost nothing left for them to say to each other. The offices were closed and dark because of the holiday, and at the deserted dock there was only one ship, its boilers damped. The sultry weather presaged the first rains of the year, but the transparent air and the Sunday silence in the harbor seemed to belong to a more benevolent month. The world was harsher here than in the shadowy cabin, and the bells caused greater grief, even if one did not know for whom they tolled. Florentino Ariza and the girl went down to the patio of saltpeter, which the Spaniards had used as a port for blacks, and where there were still the remains of weights and other rusted irons from the slave trade. The automobile was waiting for them in the shade of the warehouse, and they did not awaken the driver, asleep with his head on the steering wheel, until they were settled in their seats. The automobile turned around behind the warehouses, enclosed by chicken wire, crossed the area of the old market on Las Animas Bay, where near-naked adults were playing ball, and drove out of the river harbor in a burning cloud of dust. Florentino Ariza was sure that the funerary honors could not be for Jeremiah de Saint-Amour, but the insistent tolling filled him with doubts. He put his hand on the driver's shoulder and asked him, shouting into his ear, for whom the bells tolled. "It's for that doctor with the goatee," said the driver. "What's his name?" Florentino Ariza did not have to wonder who it was. Nevertheless, when the driver told him how he had died, his instantaneous hope vanished because he could not believe what he had heard. Nothing resembles a person as much as the way he dies, and no death could resemble the man he was thinking about less than this one. But it was he, although it seemed absurd, the oldest and best qualified doctor in the city, and one of its illustrious men for many other meritorious reasons, had died of a broken spine at the age of 81 when he fell from the branch of a mango tree as he tried to catch a parrot. Top of 276. Almost there. All that Florentino Ariza had done since Fermina Daza's marriage had been based on his hope for this event, but now that it had come, he did not feel the thrill of triumph he had imagined so often in his sleeplessness. Instead, he was seized by terror, the fantastic realization that it could just as well have been himself for whom the death knell was tolling. Sitting beside him in the automobile that jolted along the cobbled streets, America Vicuña was frightened by his pallor, and she asked him what was the matter. Florentino Ariza grasped her hand with his icy one. "Oh, my dear," he sighed, "I would need another 50 years to tell you about it." He forgot Jeremiah de Saint Amour's funeral. He left the girl at the door of the school with a hurried promise that he would come back for her the following Saturday, and he told the driver to take him to the house of Dr. Juvenal Urbino. He was confronted by an uproar of automobiles and hired carriages in the surrounding streets and a multitude of curious onlookers outside the house. The guests of Dr. Lacides Oliviella, who had received the bad news at the height of the celebration, came rushing in. It was not easy to move inside the house because of the crowd, but Florentino Ariza managed to make his way to the master bedroom, peered on tiptoe over the groups of people blocking the door, and saw Juvenal Urbino in the conjugal bed as he had wanted to see him since he had first heard of him, wallowing in the indignity of death. The carpenter had just taken his measurements for the coffin, and at his side, still wearing the dress of a newly-wed grandmother that she had just put on for the party, Fermina Daza was introspective and dejected. Florentino Ariza had imagined that moment down to the last detail since the days of his youth, when he had devoted himself completely to the cause of his reckless love. For her sake he had won fame and fortune without too much concern for his methods. For her sake he had cared for his health and personal appearance with a rigor that did not seem very manly to other men of his time. And he had waited for this day as no one else could have waited for anything or anyone in this world. Without an instant of discouragement, the proof that death had at last interceded on his behalf filled him with the courage that he needed to repeat his vow of eternal fidelity and everlasting love to Fermina Daza on her first night of widowhood. He did not deny the accusations of his conscience that it had been a thoughtless and inappropriate act once he had rushed into for fear that the opportunity would never be repeated. He would have preferred something less brutal, something in the manner he had so often imagined, but fate had given him no choice. He left the house of mourning, full of sorrow at leaving her in the same state of upheaval in which he found himself, but there was nothing he could have done to prevent it, because he felt that this barbarous night had been forever inscribed in both their destinies. For the next 2 weeks he did not sleep through a single night. He asked himself in despair where Fermina Daza could be without him, what she could be thinking, what she would do, in the years of life remaining to her, with the burden of consternation he had left in her hands. He suffered a crisis of constipation that swelled his belly like a drum. He had to resort to remedies less pleasant than enemas, the complaints of old age, which he endured better than his contemporaries because he had known them since his youth, all attacked at the same time. On Wednesday he appeared at the office after a week at home, and Leone Cassiani was horrified at seeing him so pale and enervated. But he reassured her it was insomnia again, as always, and once more he bit his tongue to keep the truth from pouring out through the bleeding wounds in his heart. The rain did not allow him a moment of sun to think in. He spent another unreal week unable to concentrate on anything, eating badly and sleeping worse, trying to find the secret signs that would show him the road to salvation. But on Friday he was invaded by an unreasoning calm, which he interpreted as an omen that nothing new was going to happen, that everything he had done in his life had been in vain, that he could not go on. It was the end. On Monday, however, when he returned to his house on the street of windows, he discovered a letter floating in a puddle inside the entrance, and on the wet envelope he recognized at once the imperious handwriting that so many changes in life had not changed, and he even thought he could detect the nocturnal perfume of withered gardenias, because after the initial shock, his heart told him everything. It was the letter he had been waiting for, without a moment's respite, for over half a century. That is the end of chapter 5.